Wonderful. Okay, so I'm now going to hand across to Lisa, who is going to introduce Ed for our session today. Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you very much, Ange, and good morning, everyone. So to quote from Your Leadership Edge, leadership and authority are different things. Leadership is an activity and authority is a role. And yet, as change makers, we're often faced with a conundrum of how do we exercise leadership and stay authorised to achieve the outcomes that we're so passionate about. So we have invited Ed O'Malley to speak with us today to share his perspectives and experience. And Liz is about to post into our chat stream the objectives for today's session. So I'd like to start off by introducing Ed. First, if I talk about what he does, he is the founding president and CEO of the Kansas Leadership Centre and one of the authors of Your Leadership Edge. He is also a former state legislator. If I was to introduce Ed, though, by my experience of who he is an enthusiastic and very generous champion of leadership who really passionately believes in making a difference for his community and for the world. He is an avid runner and a family man who I think has a very strong sense of who he is and the values that orient him. And it's always a joy to spend time with him. So Ed, over to you.
Wow, thank you very much, Lisa. It's so good to be with you and to be with you so early in the morning. So thank you to all, I think I see 68 participants on the Zoom right now. What a thrill to be with you. And I want you to know you are all welcome here in Kansas. So come anytime and we can do this again in this part of the world. I want to congratulate all of you on your participation in the Williamson program. I've been to Melbourne 4 different occasions, and I've got a chance to meet a number of Williamson graduates. And I know the program is top-notch, it's high quality, and it's quite an honor to participate in it. So congratulations to you, and I know you're working hard to learn all you can learn and apply all you can apply. Lisa, I'm struck by when you read that little excerpt from the book, how clear and simple that all sounded. And I was taken back to early 2007 when I was starting the Kansas Leadership Center. And I would just love to begin this conversation about leadership and authority by sharing how I began to think of those things as different ideas. It was actually May 1st, 2007. That was the first time that I began to think about the distinction between leadership and authority. It's the first time I began to really talk about them being two different things. And I remember it well because I was giving a speech. It was to a group of business people outside Kansas City. There were a couple hundred people in the audience, and for days my head was wrapped around this idea that maybe leadership and authority were different things. And I remember kind of throwing away my speech and just speaking about what I had been thinking about. I ended up delivering a horrible speech, but it was the first time that I began to articulate these ideas about leadership being one thing, authority being something different. And just to take you back to that moment, I was starting KLC, and I didn't have a definition of leadership. Maybe you came into Williamson with a definition of leadership on your mind. I didn't have a concise definition of leadership 12 and a half years ago. If you would have asked me then what I define leadership as, I probably would have given you a long, rambling answer about vision and having a servant's heart and being enthusiastic and engaging people or something like that. I don't know what I would have said exactly, but it would not have been concise, and I certainly would not have made a distinction between leadership and authority. And as I got into this work, I just began to realize, and we began to realize, the team we put together, that there was something going on here between the distinction of leadership and authority. Prior to May 1st, 2007, if one of you would have been talking to me about leadership as an activity and authority as something else, I think I would have nodded my head like I understood. I think I would have said, yeah, of course, yeah, leadership is an activity. It's about what you do. It's not just about who you are. But in my head, I would have still been thinking that leadership is reserved for people in authority. I hate to admit that, but I think 12 and a half years ago, that would have been the reality. And it took that day, that May 1st, 2007, early morning rambling speech to 200 people, where for the first time I'm trying to talk about these as different things. It took that for me to begin to really play with the ideas. A few weeks later, I happened to meet Marty Linsky and Ron Heifetz out at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. And little did I know, they had been thinking about these ideas for quite a while and really done some great work at separating these two ideas. So we want to spend time today talking about those two ideas. What I'd love to do is just offer a few reflections on the distinction between leadership and authority, a few ways of thinking about it that have been useful for me. I hope that this early part of our time together is sparking questions or thoughts or ideas for you for the discussion. So just to be clear, we define leadership here at the Kansas Leadership Center as mobilizing people to make progress on daunting work, to mobilize people to make progress on daunting work. I think we all know that there are a whole lot of people who are authorities who never mobilize anybody to make progress on anything. And I hate to admit it, but I've probably been that person before. When I was in politics, I'd like to say that every day I mobilized people to solve tough problems, but a lot of days I was pathetically incompetent at mobilizing anybody. So there were days when I was in authority, there were days that I was successful at exercising leadership and a whole lot of days that I wasn't successful. My guess is the same is true for you. We also have all kinds of great examples of people without authority who exercise tremendous leadership. The example that I love from our country, and I need to come up with a good Australian example, is the example of Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was a woman in the 1960s, African-American in my country, who simply decided to sit in a different spot on the bus. And by that little action, she intervened in a way that sparked a movement that led to the desegregation of buses. And she had no authority. She was not the chairwoman who was responsible for the bus integration committee. She was just a woman who decided to care and intervene, and that she'd had enough, and that she was going to take some responsibility to try to change things. So this idea that leadership and authority are two different things is just a critical foundation for Leadership Victoria and for the Kansas Leadership Center. So if leadership is mobilizing others to make progress on daunting work, that's our definition of leadership. Our definition of authority is that authority is providing protection, direction, and order. Protection, direction, and order. And we take that definition from our friends Marty Linsky and Ron Heifetz. So we can talk about the distinction between those two things in a moment. The distinction between can you provide direction and order at the same time you're trying to mobilize people to disrupt the status quo to make progress on a daunting piece of work that has been elusive. We can talk through that here in just a bit. A couple other opening remarks. One of the things I found is that exercising leadership almost always requires us to go beyond our authority, almost always requires us to do things outside of what we've been authorized to do. I think about when I was in politics, for example, the things that I would call leadership were times when I did things that my constituents, my voters, maybe didn't want me to do, but were necessary to do for the greater good. My interpretation was they were necessary for the greater good. I don't know if it's leadership if I was doing exactly what my voters wanted me to do. That might still be a fine thing to do, but I don't know if it's leadership. I think it's more like I'm following them. I'm figuring out what they want from me, and I'm delivering exactly that. To me, I think leadership was going beyond that scope of authority they gave me, doing things outside of that. My experience is leadership almost always requires us to go beyond our scope of authority, go beyond what people are expecting of us or from us. A few other thoughts I'd like to mention before we begin to open this up for questions and discussion. I've noticed that if you can get a system to believe, to understand that leadership and authority are two different things, if you get enough people in a system, in a company, in an organization, in a community, if you get enough people to orient to that idea, two things happen. And I think these two things are powerful for progress on tough issues. So this idea that leadership is an activity available to anyone, anytime, is a powerful precursor, I believe, for progress on our most daunting challenges. So if you can get a lot of people in a system, in a community, to understand this, to believe it, to think about it, to orient themselves to this belief that leadership and authority are two different things, I've noticed that two things happen. Number one, I've noticed that no one has an excuse. If you get people to understand that leadership is not just for the authorities, and that everybody has the opportunity, perhaps even the responsibility, to exercise leadership in some way, people no longer have an excuse. They can't simply blame the authorities, right? They have a piece of the mess all of a sudden. They could begin to think about, what does the exercise of leadership look like for them? Even if they're not the executive director or the CEO or the president of the company or the principal of the school or whatever it might be, they can begin to, they no longer have an easy way to be let off the hook. And that's a good thing, because we need them to engage and to work on these tough issues. The second thing I've seen happen is that if you believe that leadership is an activity and that it's available to anyone at any time, and that it's actually quite distinct from authority, it almost requires then the engagement of more people to solve tough problems. It almost requires people with authority, for example, to recognize, okay, if leadership and authority are different, and I'm an authority figure, how do I unleash leadership in this community, in this system, in this organization? And it leads on a path of greater engagement. So those two things are powerful precursors for the types of change that I know Leadership Victoria works for, that I know the Kansas Leadership Center works for, and I think many of your organizations are focused on as well. All right, I've gotten us started with, I hope, some good opening remarks just to spark some conversation. This can sound so easy and simple. Oh, leadership and authority, two different things. I think it can be quite complicated. And I think especially for those in authority, it can be complicated to know, what does the exercise of leadership look like for you? And for those without authority, it can be complicated to understand, how do you really do this without authority? How do you really exercise leadership without authority? So I hope you have questions or thoughts in your mind. I'm excited to explore with you, to think with you, to learn from you, and to share anything that we've been playing with here in our part of the world that might be useful for you and your journey. So Lisa, Angela, with that, let me pause and turn it to you all to help us think about how we facilitate the questions and the discussion.